There is this profound inherent tension when it comes to activism. On one hand, you have this overwhelming, fiery desire to go out and change the world. But on the exact opposite hand, there's the intense, very real threat of just completely burning out in the process. Human salvation lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. The striking quote from Martin Luther King Jr. perfectly sets up the theme we're exploring today. The intersection of what society often labels as madness and the vital, enduring energy required for sustained protest and social change.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating piece of source material. It's titled Mindful Occupation, Rising Up Without Burning Out. Now, this text serves as a highly practical, boots-on-the-ground toolkit that was created by and for activists. It's designed to help individuals manage intense stress, sustain those long-term protests, and provide crucial emotional first aid in highly volatile environments. And listen, whether you personally agree with the movement's politics or not, the survival and coping mechanisms they've developed here offer a very compelling look at community care in action.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap. First, defining radical mental health. Second, injustice and mental distress. Third, taking care of the basics. Fourth, mindful coping strategies. And fifth, providing psychological first aid. Starting off with Section 1, Defining Radical Mental Health, a New Perspective.
So this guide operates on a concept they call radical mental health. It's defined as a grassroots approach to well-being that genuinely values mental diversity. Rather than looking at the human experience strictly through a clinical medical lens, this framework views it as this giant, holistic convergence of social, emotional, physical, and environmental elements. The authors argue that what society often pathologizes as a disease or a disorder can actually be understood as a dangerous gift, basically altered states that, while potentially disruptive, can also contain profound expertise, creativity, and unique perspective.
The movement strongly encourages reclaiming language. For instance, the authors neutrally observe how some activists proudly reclaim the term madness as a statement of survival rather than a slur. Ultimately, they are challenging those narrow, top-down definitions of what is supposedly normal. Instead, they advocate for a wide menu of options for care. This means validating peer support, mutual aid, and community listening spaces just as much, if not more, than your traditional psychiatric interventions.
Moving right along to Section 2, Injustice and Mental Distress, Connecting the Systems.
Now, what's really interesting about this quote is how Dr. Joanna Montre frames the environment. Mainstream biopsychiatry often individualizes our problems, right? It tells people their distress is simply a chemical imbalance. But the manual asks a really provocative question. What if the distress actually stems from living in a fragmented, crazy-making world? They argue that treating the individual without addressing the environment around them misses the root cause entirely. The movement lays out some pretty specific critiques here. They impartially report that the current medico-industrial complex actually profits from framing systemic injustice as chronic individual illness. They actively question that biomedical model, linking psychological distress directly to socioeconomic inequality. In their view, these heavily medicalized approaches often act as tools of broader oppressive systems, placing a disproportionate burden on marginalized groups, specifically people of color, the poor, and LGBTQ+ individuals.
All right, Section 3, Taking Care of Basics, Surviving the Protest. The absolute most fundamental advice in the manual starts right here with the physical basics. Before you can change the world, you have to manage yourself. The text stresses the absolute necessity of getting enough sleep, even if you're in a loud encampment. They advise avoiding excessive intoxication so you can stay grounded and embodied in your physical self. Crucially, they also emphasize the importance of maintaining your personal schedule and staying on top of any existing medication regimens, even when the environment around you is completely chaotic.
Things get highly tactical here, framing physical protection as an essential survival skill. For outdoor encampments, hyperthermia is a massive, massive risk. The steps they outline are clear. Dress in synthetic, wool, and waterproof layers. Never wear cotton. Change out of wet clothes instantly. Interestingly, they actually warn against sweating because moisture freezing against your skin is incredibly dangerous. And for extreme cold, they offer this brilliant, totally surprising hack: putting a small amount of cayenne pepper inside your shoes to actually generate heat.
The authors also provide objective, purely tactical steps for dealing with police dispersants like tear gas. They warn that exposure triggers a really frightening 5 to 20-minute loss of sight and breath. So, the protocol? Walk to higher ground because the gas is heavy and it sinks. Protect your eyes with sealed plastic goggles, definitely no contacts, and use a respirator or a rag soaked in water and cider vinegar. Afterwards, wash only with cold water so your pores don't open up, using castile soap. They also highlight a vital piece of protest etiquette. Whatever you do, do not run, to avoid trampling others in the panic.
Which brings us to Section 4, Mindful Coping Strategies, Managing Stressors.
So the guide defines a stressor as any force that puts demands on your body, emotions, mind, or spirit. But the critical takeaway here is how we actually react to them. The authors draw a really sharp line between adaptive coping skills, which help you process the stress, and maladaptive coping skills, like lashing out or just suppressing your emotions completely. Sure, those might feel good in the short term, but ultimately they damage your relationships and your long-term mental health. And frankly, this applies just as much to an argument at work or at home as it does to a protest.
When a stressor triggers your body's fight or flight mode, the guide outlines very specific protocol. First, physically remove yourself from the stressor, but do not distance yourself emotionally. Actually allow yourself to feel the anger or the fear. If you're in a conflict, request a timeout. This is a universal biological truth you can use today. The manual specifically notes a 20-minute rule. It literally takes the human body about 20 minutes for the physiological chemicals of the fight or flight response to fully subside so you can re-engage rationally.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the guide advises making a conscious shift in our communication style to preserve relationships. Instead of a judgmental you statement, like, you make me feel horrible, which instantly makes the other person defensive, they suggest a mindful I statement. Try something like, it makes me feel really horrible when you use negative name-calling. It owns the emotion and targets the specific behavior, not the person.
Section 5. Providing psychological first aid, community care.
A major goal outlined in the text is the creation of ongoing emotional support spaces. Crucially, they argue these should be totally separate from standard medical tents. The whole idea is to build an environment for people to process distress safely and creatively, maybe through art, quiet spaces, or peer listening, without immediately defaulting to calling security or enforcing exclusion.
If someone is actively breaking down, the guide relies on 4 core pillars of psychological first aid. First is safety. Remove them from harm and offer simple either-or choices, like do you want water or tea, just to ground them. Second is comfort. Validate their experience. Third is language. Avoid clinical jargon and never say things like you'll feel better soon or you need to relax. Those phrases actually invalidate and minimize their trauma. And finally, connectedness. Help them reconnect with their friends and support networks so they aren't isolated.
Now, what about really severe crises or violence? The authors take a very complex community accountability approach here. If someone is suicidal, they advise asking them directly about their thoughts and plans. For violent disruptions, they emphasize verbal de-escalation first and physical separation second. The guide maintains strong reservations about traditional hospitalization and criminalization. They report that police or forced psychiatric holds often cause further trauma, and therefore should only be used as an absolute, undeniable last resort.
So the crucial point is captured beautifully in this text. Try to remember that taking care of ourselves in the emotional and physical sense is a revolutionary act. The overarching thesis of this entire manual is that self-care is not some selfish luxury or an indulgence. In the face of overwhelming systemic challenges, staying healthy, grounded, and emotionally intact is a profound political necessity.
Ultimately, the source material perfectly blends radical, anti-establishment theory with incredibly strict, on-the-ground survival tactics. It recognizes that to fight for a better world, activists have to intentionally construct systems of deep, mutual care, ensuring that they lift each other up without burning out in the flames of the protest.
We'll leave you to reflect on this final, provocative question directly derived from the text. How do we redefine what it actually means to be mentally healthy on a global level? When the world around us is deeply complex and often unjust, perhaps true wellness isn't just about fitting in, but about how we collectively support each other in standing out. Thank you for joining us for this explainer, and keep asking those big questions.